This is the dodo bird. It could not fly. An adult bird reached a height of 1 meter and weighed between 10.6 and 17.5 kilograms. It lived only on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean and was among the first species to be completely wiped out by man. In Western culture, the dodo has become the universal symbol of stupidity and evolutionary failure. Thanks to this description, it also ended up in the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This unfair reputation was cemented by the fact that, having known natural predators on the island over thousands of years, the bird lacked the instinct to flee from humans, a behavior that explorers misinterpreted as a lack of intelligence. It is a misconception that the dodo bird disappeared because it was a brainless, slow, and bumbling animal that were poorly adapted and doomed to die off, making their human-caused extinction seem simple and inevitable. But that is not the case. The real reason is much more interesting. So what were dodo birds actually like, and what really caused their disappearance? Let's start with their origin. Rewinding more than 20 million years, some tropical pigeons from Southeast Asia voyaged across the Indian Ocean, perhaps gradually journeying from island to island. Eventually, their descendants reached a remote archipelago east of Madagascar. Those that settled there diversified over time. Then, about 8 million years ago, an underwater volcano formed another island in the chain, which would come to be known as Mauritius. At first, it was just a rock, but the wind and ocean currents transported various plants, transforming the island into a green paradise. Approximately 4 million years ago, some distant relatives of pigeons populated this new island, and over time, dodo birds emerged as a distinct species. They shared Mauritius with bats, lizards, giant tortoises, and other birds. The closest large predators were held back by about 800 kilometers of ocean, so the risk of being killed was practically non-existent. Food was everywhere. Without the need for defensive adaptations, such as flight, expending energy to maintain them would have been a waste. Therefore, their flight muscles shrank. Dodo birds nested on the ground, feeding on fruits and seeds. Reaching just under a meter tall, they were among the largest animals on the island, and they were well adapted to their environment, which could fluctuate between conditions of extreme drought and humidity. The dodo bird has a very developed sense of smell, an unusual thing for birds, which likely helped it search for fruits and invertebrates on the forest floor. Evolution did what it knows best. When you have nothing to run from, you no longer need large wings. Its beak grew larger to eat hard fruits. When food is plentiful, you become large. This is called island gigantism. Over millions of years, small pigeons became giant birds, nearly a meter tall. Recent studies have demonstrated that the ratio between body size and brain size was comparable to that of a modern pigeon. This countered the myth of lack of intelligence. The dodo bird's biggest mental problem was another. Because there had been no danger for millions of years, fear had completely disappeared. They simply no longer had a fight or flight instinct. You could put a monster in front of the bird, and it would treat it with indifference. Dodos also survived major disruptions. Around 4,300 years ago, a mega drought caused waves of mass mortality on Mauritius. Fresh water became scarce, and lakes likely became saltier and turned into treacherous traps. This lasted for about 150 years. However, the dodo birds prevailed until a few millennia later, when everything changed quickly. In 1598, Dutch sailors landed on Mauritius, and the island soon became a welcome stopover for their merchant ships on the way to India and from India to Europe. The sailors described natural wonders, including a large number of birds twice as big as swans and tortoises with shells huge enough to fit 10 men. Mauritian animals had not evolved to fear being hunted by humans, so they were an easy catch. Sailors ate some dodos, but this alone did not cause their undoing. Notes in their travel journals mentioned dodo birds as being easy to catch because they could not fly and had no fear. They also mentioned dodo bird meat as being tasteless, but the size of a single bird made a meal possible for a few hungry sailors. The name dodo may have come from the sound they made, as the Dutch heard doo-doo or doo-doo, much like the name of the cuckoo comes from the sound made by these birds, cuckoo. Sailors likely adopted this sound to identify the animal. The most popular version is, it is believed that Portuguese sailors who visited the island before the Dutch called the bird Dodo, in modern Portuguese doido, which means crazy or stupid. This label was attributed again due to the bird's total lack of fear of humans. Having no natural predators, the dodo did not flee from the sailors, letting itself be caught easily, which was misinterpreted as stupidity. Historical Dutch documents suggest a much more descriptive and anatomical origin. Dutch sailors called the bird dodars. The name referred to the tuft of short, curly feathers on the bird's posterior, which resembled a knot. This is considered by linguists to be a very plausible explanation, with the term gradually transforming into dodo. Most likely, the current name is a combination of the Dutch term dodars and the influence of the Portuguese word, both describing a creature that seems strange and comical in the eyes of 17th century Europeans. One more very important aspect made the dodo very easy prey. When the bird was hunted, its scream made other dodo birds come, allowing the Dutch to catch a multitude of dodos at the same time, even though they were only hunting one. Capturing was a matter of simply walking up to the animal, not luring it with complex social signals. The veracity of these claims relies entirely on the written notes left by the sailors, officers, and travelers of the Dutch East India Company. These texts evolve from logistical notes to confused, almost mythological descriptions as the species entered decline. The account of a certain Everts, published in 1670, contains the relevant passage. Amongst other birds were those which men in the Indies call dodaersen. They were larger than geese, but not able to fly. One of us would chase them so that they ran towards the other party, who then grabbed them. When we had one tightly held by the leg, it would cry out. Then the others would come to its aid and could be caught as well. Also, dodo birds had a low birth rate. They basically laid only one egg per year in a nest on the ground because there were no predators to eat them. In Mauritius, the climate cycle is dominated by a wet and warm summer between November and March, characterized by the passage of devastating cyclones, and a cooler and drier winter in April to October. The dodo adjusted its egg-laying period according to this factor. Bone data indicate that dodo chicks grew extremely rapidly in the first months of life, August to November, to reach physical maturity before the cyclone season. With the arrival of the Dutch, Mauritius suddenly became another planet. Sailors came with company. They brought macaques, which were likely pets. They released goats and pigs on the island to establish food sources, and inadvertently the sailors introduced rats to the island. Goats and pigs grazed and rooted through the forest understory where the dodo birds lived. A dodo nest, located at ground level, was an easy target. Pigs, macaques, and rats preyed on dodo eggs and chicks, and all competed with the dodo birds for resources. The situation worsened even more later. The Dutch realized that the island was full of hardwood, ebony, wood that cost a lot even then, and they began to massively deforest the island. The forest, which was the only protection for the dodo, disappeared. The birds remained stuck in the open, more vulnerable than ever. Dodo birds were last seen less than a century after the arrival of the Dutch. Some sources say that just 24 years of human intervention were enough for them to disappear completely. At that time, people did not know that species could disappear. It was not until a century later, in the 1790s, that the scientist Baron Georges Cuvier conclusively demonstrated the concept of extinction. Until then, many thought dodo birds were fake. But discoveries from excavations and sparse remains helped confirm their existence. Once Lewis Carroll included a dodo bird in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, the birds quickly gained popularity. This work cemented the image of the dodo as a comical, solemn, but inefficient character. Dodo birds continued to be presented as inept, clumsy, lazy, and unfit for survival in scholarly works, satirical magazines, and children's poems alike. And yet, There is no evidence that dodo birds were less intelligent than their relatives. The size of the dodo bird's brain in relation to its body was similar to that of other pigeons. Modern science rejects the teleology of evolutionary failure. The dodo was an evolutionary success perfectly adapted to its environment. Its stupidity was merely a behavior unprepared for a completely new context, the appearance of man, a context for which no island species was prepared. And the particularly round representations of dodo birds are misleading. They may have been inspired by how dodo birds looked during mating displays or in captivity, or they were simply poor artistic renderings. Scientists believe that dodo birds were actually quite muscular birds. All in all, the dodo bird was, in fact, a survivor that withstood major natural disasters and thrived in its island home. It simply was not prepared for a sudden onslaught of invasive species. The lesson is clear. Comfort makes us soft. It makes us get used to it. A life devoid of challenges leads to vulnerability. The dodo got too used to the easy life, but let's not blame the bird for that. It was the result of millions of years of evolution. Ultimately, it was more convenient to categorize the disappearance of the dodo bird as a failure of nature than to admit it was, in fact, a human error. Though it never flew, the dodo left behind a legacy that soars through history.